Hey all, here at OS Reviews, you're watching our video review of the Apple iPhone 6 Plus here in early 2018. This was the first 5.5-inch phablet from Apple that came out in September of 2014, making it over 3 years old. And in this video, we'll be discussing whether it's still a worthwhile smartphone to consider at a reduced price on Amazon or eBay. So first of all, the phone can now be found if you purchase it through a third-party seller for roughly $200 to $250, which is of course many times less expensive than a more current flagship such as an iPhone 8 or an iPhone 10, which can cost you up to $1,000. The iPhone 6 Plus, of course, will now be purchased without a contract, which means that most likely it can also be easily unlocked so you can use it on any carrier globally. So taking a quick look at the specifications of the 6 Plus, it was also the first iPhone with a full 1080p display, making it crisp and still a very enjoyable experience for watching videos and interacting with media. The display of iPhones have always been, again, very accurate looking, perhaps not quite as saturated as Samsung Super AMOLED panels, but it's still very enjoyable and, again, boasts very well calibrated colors. Otherwise, the 6 Plus at the time was the thinnest ever iPhone from Apple, and even now it remains shockingly thin. It's very lightweight, it measures only 0.28 inches thick, and only 6.07 ounces. And the entire body, of course, is made out of this classic aluminum shell, so it still looks actually quite premium, thanks in large part to Apple recycling many elements of the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus's design, even in today's iPhone 8 and 8 Plus. You get very similar dimensions, and cases are also very similar as well. So if you're using one of these phones and you're taking it out on the street, it still looks, again, quite current, at least on the outside. So taking a closer look at the hardware here, on the bottom we do have a Lightning port for charging. I have a magnetic adapter plugged in. There's access to a speaker. Unfortunately, on the iPhone 6 Plus at the time, there was only one speaker. There's no front-facing secondary speaker that dubs as the earpiece. There is, however, a 3.5mm headphone jack, so if you are someone who consistently listens to music and needs a real headphone, then that's one reason to pick the 6 Plus compared to the more current 8 Plus. The back also features an 8-megapixel autofocus camera with optical image stabilization, which was a first for an iPhone at the time, along with a dual LED flash. Now, like the 6 Plus's camera protrudes from the edge of the unit, although it's coated in a layer of sapphire crystal. On the back we also see some streamlined antennas which are crafted out of plastic for the Wi-Fi, GPS, Bluetooth, compass, as well as 4G LTE signals to be sent out. On the side there's access to a there's a power switch along with a nano SIM card slot, and on the other side there is a volume rocker which is tactile and responsive along with a lock key. So as a whole, the design of the phone is still quite elegant and beautiful here in 2018, although it is still quite slippery and at the same time a little easy to scratch because it's crafted out of aluminum. Alright, so on the front we have access to that classic Apple home key, and this was one of the first phones that came with the Touch ID fingerprint scanner, which is an excellent feature because it allows you to use mobile payment just by tapping your finger instead of entering a physical password. So you can use this in the App Store when you're downloading programs, as well as when you're in stores that support mobile payment. There's also access to a front-facing camera on the top here for FaceTime and other chatting applications, along with the earpiece. So in 2018, the phone is actually still fully supported as far as software. It's probably not going to be supported for too much longer, but you can still run the latest iOS version 11 on this thing, although older phones will begin to feel slower and slower, and that's just because newer software tends to be a bit more demanding on the processor and the GPU, as well as the RAM, which are all elements that an older device will struggle with slightly more. Regardless, iOS is still quite stable, especially compared to an older Android phone from 3 years ago, and as a whole, the interface remains relatively responsive, especially if you have a unit with, again, a relatively good battery life as well. Otherwise, of course, the iPhone came with several different colors. The processor was the A8, which was this 64-bit processor, the first 64-bit processor that Apple used. This is complemented with 1 gig of RAM, along with a 2,950 milliamp hour battery. So as always, Apple iPhones seem to not be quite as fast on paper compared to Android smartphones when it comes comes to RAM. And even back in the day, 1 gig of RAM was considered low because flagships running on Android would have 2 gigs, some even 3 gigs. And this hasn't really changed. It's really just iOS being much more efficient in terms of optimizing multitasking and running programs. So because the software is more consistent, more cohesive, more carefully put together, it seems like the mobile OS is also slightly less picky when it comes to requiring more RAM necessarily. The battery capacity, a little under 3,000 milliamp hours, also isn't bad. It will still last you easily a day to 2 days on a single charge, and on standby time it will last you for quite a few days longer than that. When it comes to the call quality, of course, this is an area where a phone doesn't really change. The 6 Plus has excellent reception quality with AT&T, at least here in the Seattle region in our testing, and the microphone offers noise cancellation, so it works well even in outdoor environments. As a whole, it's good for basic communication and for phone calls. Taking a quick look at the keyboard now, so this is one area where the 6 Plus with its large display, just like the 6S Plus, the 7 Plus, the 8 Plus benefits. If you have a larger screen on board, you also have the addition of shortcuts on the sides that Apple introduced first on this model, and this includes copy and pasting as well as addiction using your voice, emojis, in addition to selecting things using these arrow keys on the sides. So you have this keyboard option, and the 6 Plus was also the first time that Apple introduced the ability to switch orientation anywhere starting from the main screen. So I can switch between, you can see the orientation here just like on a tablet. So really the 6 Plus at the time was this fusion between a traditional smartphone and a smaller tablet such as the iPad mini, bridging the gap in between. Alright, so a quick size comparison. Dimensions are pretty similar to Samsung Galaxy Notes, as well as this is the Xiaomi Mi Note 2. And you can see that you have virtually the same sized phones, even though Xiaomi has a 5.7-inch display, so there are smaller bezels on the top and on the bottom. But otherwise, in terms of thickness and overall feel in the hand, they are ridiculously par on par, even with the overall feel as well. So no longer quite as unique, no longer quite as differentiated as this really premium build, because lately we've been seeing more and more Android devices that have increasingly excellent build qualities. And of course, over the past 2 years, there are less and less plastic Android phones. So as a whole, that is an area where Android is catching up. All right, so taking a closer look now, we still have access to a drag-down notification drawer, which Apple eventually borrowed from Android, that gives us access to detailed information on our news. There's also notifications if they want to pop up on the side. And down below here, I can also drag upwards to have access to quick shortcuts onto things such as adjusting the brightness of the display, adjusting the volume, as well as wireless information and AirDrop, as well as basic utilities like the flashlight, in addition to a calculator. So this is an area that is different from Android. It's split essentially into the top and onto the bottom. For multitasking, if you're not familiar, you simply double tap on the home button, which physically presses down on the 6 Plus compared to more current iPhones that uses a haptic vibration feedback that allows us to easily toggle back and forth between running apps as well as close out of ones which aren't needed. Again, for only 1 gig of RAM, the iPhone 6 Plus still holds up pretty well in terms of overall smoothness, especially for multitasking. I was actually quite surprised coming over from an Android device. The fingerprint sensor is no longer the fastest. In fact, it seems a little sluggish now, especially since I've been used to more current flagships, but overall it still works, and for the most part it's pretty sensitive to use. Alright, so dragging down from the main screen also opens up the universal search. To the left, there's a separate page dedicated to commonly used applications and also nearby services based on your location. Finally, there are some articles and RSS feeds based on the type of news that you're interested in, for instance, politics or technology, and it will populate accordingly each time that you're connected to the internet, either using Wi-Fi or cellular data. So pretty similar to something like Blink Feed on HTC or Flipboard on a Samsung phone. Taking a look at the camera, back in the day, the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus were known to have one of the best cameras on a smartphone. So this is still a pretty good shooter in general. You have a good field of view, and overall you can tap to focus, change the exposure level, and have a pretty simple interface for snapping away shots. It's still very quick in terms of capturing your images, so there's no complaints there. Now, one area, of course, that Apple has improved upon their camera technology is having slightly larger lens aperture that allows better performance in low light situations, and of course slowly increasing increasing the resolution, which gives you more details for cropping and zooming in. But in general, there are all the basics that you would want on the 6 Plus's camera, and in 2018 it still makes for a pretty good camera on a phone. Certainly is better than most mid-end phones that you would have on Android in the same price category. So a pretty good shooter, definitely not as good as flagship phones both on Android and on iOS today, but good enough. So here we also have a few settings that allows us to change to the front-facing camera, which is also pretty good in terms of field of view. It captures a good amount of light, which makes it useful for selfies and for video chatting. There's also the self-timer modes. You can change HDR mode on and off, and it works again very well here because of the optical image stabilization. So you can even slightly shake the phone if your hands aren't completely still, and it still captures the shot without any issues. The flash, two-tone LED flash, also works pretty well when there is little to no light. Here we have a few filters that I can play around with directly, and I can also change the type of image or photo that I'm recording, capturing video up to 1080p, slow motion, time lapse, and you can see that the interface still remains fairly smooth and responsive. So let's take a quick look at some of these sample shots that I took recently on this phone, and you can tell that overall the image quality seems to be pretty good. Zooming in even, it captures a pretty realistic looking shots, which has always been one of the strengths of iPhone cameras, is you get a good sense of realism. There's also a good field of depth, so if you are focusing on an object really close to the lens, everything in the background, even relatively close by, will become blurred out. It's almost this natural bokeh effect that a lot of dual lens cameras these days tries to emulate. And then even in outdoor environments where the sun is setting, you can really capture some beautiful artistic looking shots even without the use of filters. So you can see the background being blurred out, whereas this branch is fully visible and quite detailed. So overall, again, a pretty good camera concerning the age of the phone now and the fact that the price is now much lower. Here's an image shot using HDR. You can see it punches out the colors a little bit more. It seems brighter than normal. And this is an example of the sense of depth because the shrimp here is in focus, but everything in the background is really artistically blurred out. So all in all, still a pretty good camera. You don't have the most detail in the world since it's not a crazy 20 or 30 megapixel sensor for zooming all the way in, but for some casual shots for sharing on social media, for some beautiful looking images and colors, it still works as an excellent camera. For web browsing, let's check out Safari. Now there is Chrome and many other competitors like Firefox available on iOS, so you can try out different alternatives if you're invested into a different ecosystem. But I find Safari to be also a pretty smooth and responsive browser. It's based on WebKit. It's one of the first browsers that supported multi-touch and was really optimized for smartphones back when the first iPhone was released. So it continues to be a pretty good experience. You can see that web browsing overall still remains enjoyable. I've loaded up the New York Times and it's defaulted to the mobile version, but overall you can still see a wide range of images as well as ads and moving elements popping up, and the phone is still keeping up in terms of scrolling, and general navigation is still relatively quick. You have to wait for a split second longer when you are entering the addresses of complex pages, however. So if you're loading up the New York Times or CNET from scratch, then you have to wait slightly longer than you would on the newest iPhone 8 or iPhone 10, since the processor and the RAM isn't quite as fast in today's standards. But overall, not a bad experience at all. So the browser here allows us to tap to change to a different address. I can also go back by tapping on cancel here. And on the bottom here, I can go back and forth between previous pages, new pages. This brings up a menu that allows me to share it using AirDrop, which is this way of mirroring your display onto a supported television, a smart TV. And I can also share this page through different social media services. Alright, so pausing the sound there, you can tell that for video watching it makes for a great enjoyable experience because again, the display here is still quite sharp and has very accurate looking colors. You can tell that video playback is no problem for the phone either. It remains quite quick in terms of buffering and also streaming between different parts of the video, and the interface remains, again, pretty stable even if you're playing back longer clips or clips in full 1080p. The speaker here also gets quite loud, and it's a very clean sounding speaker. With that being said, it doesn't pack that much bass. It's also not stereo. As aforementioned, unlike something such as the HTC One M8 or even the newer iPhones that has a secondary speaker on top, for a more immersive experience, you only get one on the bottom. However, having a real headphone jack is a plus, and you can always plug in your own headphones or a pair of speakers for a better audio experience. But all in all, it makes for a pretty enjoyable experience for watching videos and for other media content. Other utility apps are quite familiar if you've used any other iPhone, iPod Touch, or iPad in recent memory, and they work well without any problems. There is the calendar, which has notifications that you can sync onto the cloud. There's the weather, which dynamically changes the background depending on what the temperature feels like. There's also the clock, alarm clock functionality, all very simple and still quite similar to what we saw on the very first generation of the iPhone many years ago. Apple Pay and Apple Wallet were services introduced with the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus, and they still work quite well. It's a form of contactless mobile payment, so that when you are going to a store and there's a scanner, you can just tap the phone on the back to pay. You can also use your fingerprint as an added layer of security, so you can store the credit card as well as other information directly on the phone quite securely. It works because Apple's operating system is also very secure. It's much harder to crack, much harder to hack than on Android. So you have a peace of mind knowing that the software at least is encrypted and your data is secure. Otherwise, there's also access to, again, Notes, which is also synced now to the cloud, at least your iTunes account. There's also access to the App Store. And speaking of the App Store, this is another area where having a fingerprint scanner really helps. You don't have to type out the password every time you want to download an app. All you have to do is tap using your fingerprint as the password, and a new installation can begin. So it's quite efficient. Taking a look at health, again, this app basically uses the accelerometer to tell you how many steps you've walked, and it works if you don't have a fitness tracker and you want to very quickly look at basic statistics. You can also connect it to an Apple Watch for more enhanced biometrics like heart rate data. Under extras, we see a compass. There's also voice memos for recording notes using the microphone, and there's also the Find iPhone, which allows you to use your iTunes on a computer to say that you've lost your phone, and you can deactivate it or privately wipe it as well as try to find it. So again, it's pretty useful to have this built right on in. When it comes to some of these other apps on here, I've downloaded the mobile version of YouTube as well as Facebook Messenger. They both work without any problems. Even when you have lots of apps open in the background, as you can see here, it still remains pretty fluid and responsive overall UI experience. And in terms of gaming, for most games, at least for regular games like Stack that aren't really graphically intensive, it still loads up and plays pretty quickly. If you're playing back the most graphically demanding titles like Asphalt 8 or something like that, then it may stutter and have a few more dropped frames compared to a brand new device coming out now. But overall, it still remains, again, very playable, especially considering the number of apps I have open right now in the background. And since it supports the latest version of iOS, of course, any games and apps from the store can be still fully downloaded and played without any problems. Finally, if we just take a quick look at the music player, that really is what started it all for Apple music players and MP3 players. It still works quite well as an iPod. The interface has gone through some dramatic changes through the past few years, but we also have the presence of an online radio, and you can scan through catalogs of music collections that Apple has through iTunes, download them by packages individually, and store them to your collection. So as a music player, of course, it works quite well, especially since you still have a real headphone jack on the 6 Plus. So that's more or less it for our throwback review of the iPhone 6 Plus here in early 2018. Overall, I would say that it's still a phone that's worthwhile picking up if you're on a budget, and you can find it for around $200 or even lower. At this price point, it's about the same price you would pay anyways for a mid-end Android phone, coming out now. And performance is really quite similar in terms of most tasks, such as some of these games and apps I've downloaded, in addition to media streaming and for calling, as well as a pretty good image quality overall. Areas where it's no longer quite as good would be playing back the most demanding titles, where you'll notice some more sluggishness. And also, since it has only 1 gig of RAM, of course, if you are opening up tons and tons of apps, it's an area where you'll notice some occasional sluggishness. The Retina Plus display still remains quite competitive with newer iPhones, and the presence of a fingerprint scanner, again, really is the start of more modern iPhones as we know it today. So overall, everything that you would want to do, from payment to calling to apps to entertainment and video, all still work surprisingly well on the iPhone 6 Plus. Obviously, it's no longer the best of the best. It doesn't have the best camera anymore in terms of resolution. It also will struggle a little bit more in terms of battery endurance, especially if you pick up a used device. It's also no longer the fastest, as we talked about, for gaming and certain things like that. But everything still runs surprisingly well, so if you want an alternative to an Android phablet at around the same price with still very good performance, then this is something to check out. So thanks for watching this video here at OS Reviews. This has been our throwback review of the iPhone 6 Plus here in early 2018.